Today on The State of Us, the danger of the power grid in the United States of America. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, the friendly redneck liberal and senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. Today, we're discussing how America's power grid is increasingly unreliable. This is from a article in the Wall Street Journal, and it reads, behind a rising number of outages are new stresses on the system caused by aging power lines, a changing climate, and a power plant fleet rapidly going green. So there's several different things to talk about, both the age of the grid, the changing climate situation, and the generation and storage of electricity. So we're going to look at all of those. Why you should care about this, hopefully, is pretty self-evident. Electricity, if you think about it, all these things you do in your everyday life, think about how many things are totally dependent on reliable, safe electricity. It's truly interwoven into the fabric of our lives, and it's very important we talk about this because the horizon is very concerning when we start to look at what the data tells us. But before we dive into that, Lance, what's the word of the day?
Well, the word of the day is two syllables, tristful, Tristful. It is an adjective, and it means sad, sorrowful, and melancholy. So not only is the topic today somewhat tristful, but that is my mood, and it probably does not bode well for Justin as the show continues.
People don't get to hear the sound check, but at the time that we're having this conversation, the early April showers have set in, and we're headed for several days of doom and gloom and wet and rain and damp. And so the mood is tristful, if not set by nature, by the other factors that contribute to how we view our world outlook. So the first thing up is the age of the grid and understanding how that plays into what we're seeing. And you might say, is there really an issue with the grid? Well, in the year 2000, there were fewer than 24 major disruptions. In 2020, however, the number surpassed 180. So a pretty multifold increase there, Lance, in the number of substantive power disruptions.
Yeah, it shows there's a problem. We will agree on that today, that there is a problem with the power grid in the United States and is old and ancient, and we need to update it sooner than later.
And utility customers also on average experienced just over 8 hours of power interruptions in the year 2020, which was more than double the amount in 2013, which is when the government began tracking outages. So just in a span of 7 years, the number of outages doubled. So I think that's pretty notable too. And you might say then the next question, Lance, that people would have is, well, why is that happening?
Mm-hmm.
And there's several things, right, that go into what's contributing to that.
Well, we want to know, if I'm not getting my electricity, why am I not getting my electricity, right? And the problem is a lot of this, the grid, as they say, the way from the point of the energy being created and then the energy being dispersed to the people who need it, much of it was built prior to World War II, which for those of you who aren't up on dates means in the 1930s, and early 1940s. So we're looking at things that were built 80 years ago, and not a knock on things that were built a long time ago, because they were built very well. But I think the article mentions that more than 50 to 60% of the grid is in its last legs of standing, that it was built to last a certain number of years, and those years are quickly dissipating. We have gotten the entire life usage out of many parts of the grid. So we're not even getting into talking about whether it's clean energy or what it's doing to the climate or anything like that. Just the very simple fact that it needs to be replaced because most of it was built so long ago that it's just wearing out.
It's similar to the conversation that's being had, I think, right now too, about bridges and certain roads across the United States, people are like, well, why are all our bridges in such bad shape? Well, because they're really freaking old. They were built a long time ago. They've held up. They've lived their lifespan, but they don't last. Nothing lasts forever.
It's kind of like your friendly redneck liberal. I'm getting freaking old. And
Time for an infrastructure
things
upgrade.
are breaking down, and there's not enough medical science to put me back together again.
The good news is with the grid and bridges, we can actually replace them with new versions.
If we're willing to spend the money.
Correct.
And therein lies the rub, right? Because we all want things that make our life better, but do we really want to pay for them? Because we are talking about, we've looked up, different things here, and it's not that we don't have the technology or the capability to do some of these things, but it would increase the cost. And boy, today everybody's upset about anytime you talk about things getting more expensive. Well, it's just a part of life, I guess. And then that's what I can tell people. If you want something, you're going to have to pay for it. In this case, it's not just we want it, we're going to need it.
I think one thing to take into account too is, depending on how long you've been alive as a listener, try to think back to, your childhood and think about where things are today. And think about how much of what you do relies on electricity. If you really think about it, you'd probably come to the conclusion that life has become more and more dependent on electricity, and probably will continue to do so, especially as the transformation of what types of energy we use, from everything like your stove, moving away from gas-powered cooking appliances and things like furnaces and other forms of heat, moving toward more electric forms of heat. As those things start to take place, electricity becomes increasingly important, right? The electricity in our lives and the dependence on the grid are increased as one of the things that depends on, can we even function? Can we cook our food? Can we keep the house warm? We're not even getting into quote unquote luxuries like watching TV or something. We're talking about the basic things that people expect to provide them their survival. Why is that happening? Well, one component is that the grid is currently undergoing the largest transformation in history. In many parts of the U.S., utilities are no longer the dominant producers of electricity, following the creation of a patchwork of regional wholesale markets in which suppliers compete to build power plants and sell their output at the lowest price. The pace of change, hastened by market forces and long-term efforts to reduce carbon emissions, has raised concerns that power plants will retire more quickly than they can be replaced, creating new strain on the grid at a time when other factors are converging to weaken it. A report last year by the American Society of Civil Engineers found that 70% of transmission and distribution lines are well into the second half of their expected 50-year lifespans. Utilities across the country are ramping up spending on line maintenance and upgrades. Still, the ASCE report anticipates that by 2029, the U.S. will face a gap of about $200 billion in funding to strengthen the grid and meet renewable energy goals. A $200 billion gap. I was
talking about earlier in the show. I said, it gets old and we got to pay to get it done, and it's going to be expensive.
And you probably don't have that $200 billion under the mattress.
No, I'd have to dig that in the backyard.
Oh, okay. We got to go out back, get the shovel out.
For that kind of money, it's in the backyard.
Okay. Got to find the loose change jars around the house.
Yeah.
Okay. You have to go
break into the piggy banks to get that kind of money.
So what else is going into it? What else is there to talk about when we talk about the grid? Well, one of those is the changing climate. How are weather events affecting the wear and tear on the grid? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. We talked about the shortfall of investment right before the break, right? $208 billion shortfall by 2029 and a $338 billion shortfall by 2039. So not good. We've got some problems there with the money that's going to be needed just to maintain, and I think this is very important, right? Just to take care of what we already have. We're not talking about the need to increase capacity amongst the grid.
Yeah, we're not talking about upgrading, right? We're not talking about making it better. I mean, we are making it better, but we're just making it better by replacing it. We're not talking about adding new technology or the number of items that we're going to use in the future that need electricity. And then obviously we need, for lack of better terminology, lines that can carry the amount of electricity that are going to be pumping into our places of business and our homes.
So the changing climate, one of those items is severe weather events, right, Lance? And the fact that the United States power lines are mostly above ground. And you might say, well, isn't that how all power lines are? Well, no. In some other parts of the world, it's actually common for it to be the opposite, to have buried underground lines. And I was remarking to Lance actually before the show that I've taken notice recently. There's an expansion project going on in our small town, in town, and where it's happening is there's above ground lines, power lines that have to be moved. And as I was looking at that, I was driving home the other day, and in the little subdivision that I live in, I was noticing that, hey, there's no power lines anywhere here. And of course, there are power lines. We have electricity, but they're underground and you don't see them. So even in the US, obviously, there's lots of places that have underground power lines. It's just that most of the power grid is, in fact, above ground lines. So that's another consideration, because severe weather tends to impact, basic logic. If the line is underground, it's less likely that a fire, for example, a wildfire is going to impact.
But it's not as simple as let's just take down the power lines and the power poles and put them underground, right?
Right.
I mean,
you can't just stick it in the ground.
Because I don't want anybody out there to think, oh, let's just take care of this. Let's just bury these suckers. Oh, we have the technology. We can do it. Are you willing to pay for it? Because it's very, very expensive. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars for each area of the country, not just overall, but this can be, there's not even people really looking into this as we tried to find information. The best that Justin could come up with was this article from the University of Florida. And, as I was just glancing through it, there's something here, and correct me, but they're talking about just this one part of the country, and it would take over $4.7 billion to improve this area that would only help a third of its customers.
Yeah. Well, and to drive that point home, according to this piece from University of Florida, burying power lines costs roughly $1 million per mile. But the geography and or the population density of the service area can halve the cost, or it can triple it. So it could be as little as $500,000 per mile to bury the electric lines. Or it could be as much as $3 million per mile, depending on the population density. And you say, well, just to be clear about that, right? If we're talking about in the heart of New York City, the efficiency that you receive, right, for 1 mile of buried power line is far greater than you do out here in rural Champaign County, where, your closest neighbor might be a mile down the road. That mile, comparatively speaking, is very expensive because it's not providing power to a lot of people. It's providing power to fewer people.
Or if you're trying to bury power lines through the Rocky Mountains.
Right. There's a lot of factors. That's
going to be very cost prohibitive.
Yes.
To get, and again, the population density isn't as such. So the cost per mile goes up because you don't have as many residents, but yet they need power as well. And how do you dig? We've done that before, right? To build the Transcontinental Railroad, to go through the Rocky Mountains and, to do those kinds of things. But it's very, very expensive.
And nationally, roughly 25% of new distribution and transmission lines are built underground. So only about a fourth of new power lines are actually placed underground. And the article doesn't go into this, but my guess is, anecdotally, Lance, those are probably focused heavily on new housing developments. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, two reasons. One is you're planning a big new area, so it's more practical to plan that out. Second thing is that the aesthetic cost is a factor, right? I mean, people, if you're living in a neighborhood, if you had the choice between big overhead lines strung out in front of your house versus not seeing them, I'd imagine that there wouldn't be a lot of people that would choose to have the eyesore if there was no difference, in their bottom line as a result. The problem is, and that's, as Lance had highlighted, there's sadly not a lot of, at least without more thorough research from our part, there's not a lot of readily available information on the cost breakdown of that. In other words, when you put up a new, place like that, how much is that really affecting how much I spent for my house, right? Or how much is in my electric bill? And the truth is, I don't know. And I'm not sure, I don't know if there is, I know the data was probably out there. I don't know if anybody's done the work to assemble the data to answer the question.
Nobody's looking into it because it's cost prohibitive. I mean, okay, we can do all this work and present it, and nobody's going to pay any attention to it because on a large scale measure, it's just too daggone expensive.
And then you get into these severe weather events, right? Because this plays into where do you do it, right? Because the thing that we talk about all the time, Lance, is it's never, never, and never always, right? I think there are plenty of places probably around the United States where overhead lines make reasonable sense, If you want to live in a place and pay a little bit more so that your lines are underground, that's okay. But in lots of places, you could say, we don't really have a lot of severe weather concerns most of the time that affect the power lines. Now, if you live in an area that's prone to wildfires or hurricanes, you might be more considering of the economic cost of losing power. Okay?
Ice storms.
Yeah, ice storms. Because a 2009 study estimated the economic cost of $10.60 for an 8-hour interruption in electricity service to an average residential customer. Well, that doesn't sound so bad. $10 for 8 hours of interruption. I mean, is that really that bad? However, it's not so much the residential side, because for an average small commercial or industrial customer, the cost grew to $5,195 and to almost $70,000 for an average medium to large commercial or industrial customer. And that's just per one customer, mind you. So yes, on the residential side, it's inconvenient, but from a real cost standpoint to you, it's more of an inconvenience than it is a big effect on your bottom line to lose power for maybe 4 to 8 hours, right? Because if you're smart, you keep your refrigerator closed, that kind of stuff, you're probably not going to have a lot of material money out the door. Yes, it was inconvenient. You probably had to adjust a few things, but you probably got through it. For businesses, right? Like take, for example, a, busy restaurant. Well, we're just done. I mean, we just can't sell anything right now. We have nothing to offer. So we are just losing the money because we're not actively selling anything.
Well, and that nobody pays attention to because we all think that we just become accustomed. Well, if I go flip the switch, the light comes on. Or, I don't ever check to see. I mean, the refrigerator is always running, right? And we just become accustomed to that. It's always going to be there. And it's not until we don't have it that we begin to look into why is there a problem? And here's your burying thing. And here's the problem when you start to do this. 20 years ago, when we added on to our house, I lost $1,000 worth of food in the garage where I had a freezer because the construction people cut a line from the pole in the, running the wire underneath to the garage. And so the garage lost power. We didn't know it and went out there and went on vacation, came back, and there was $1,000 worth of food in the freezer that was gone because they cut the power line underneath in the ground as they were doing some construction. So not only is it expensive, but there's also, it's fine. Like when you talking about building a new subdivision, you can bury it. That's fine until 100 years from now and that subdivision is gone and they clear all the houses and they start to dig stuff up. Now they're cutting into the power lines. Whereas if they're above ground, you can see them. They're easier to get to. They're easier to repair when they need to be replaced or when there is damage. It's a catch-22. I mean, it's a tough, what do we do? And because we all remember down in Texas, right? This winter when they lost power because of the storm coming through and the grid shut down. And there are places in California that have had rolling blackouts. I know that where my sister lives, and they charge them different rates for different times of the day for their electricity to try to get them off the peak usages. And that's another point of this article is they say the rolling blackouts are going to become the norm, that we're all just going to have to, especially in the metropolitan areas, become accustomed to this. Because we need the rolling blackouts to make sure the whole grid doesn't fail everybody.
So what do we do about all this? I mean, to Lance's point of, well, what do we do? What is being done? Because blaming this on any one thing is just incorrect. It's just not reality. Is there a problem with the aging grid? Yes. Is the transition to renewable energy presenting challenges that have to somehow be overcome? Yes. Even if we weren't transitioning to renewable energy, would we still have a problem? Yes. So it's not, oh, well, we're going green and that's ruining everything. No, that's not the only issue. Is the grid failing because it's old? That's not the only issue. There are multiple things that go into this. And one of those is as we transition to new forms of energy, how do we maintain reliable access to power? So even if we get all the power lines perfect, right, and they're just the best that ever lived, whether they're underground, above ground, whatever it might be, how do we make sure that there is power and these blackouts that Lance talks about don't happen? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Companies around the country are rapidly adding large-scale batteries to store more intermittent power so it can be discharged during peak periods after the sun falls and wind dies. But because such storage technology is somewhat new and was until recently relatively expensive, it remains a small fraction of the electricity market, and grid operators agree that much more will be needed to keep the system stable as more conventional power plants retire. So this tracks back to the beginning of the episode, Lance, where we talked about coal power plants. I mean, I hope that it's no secret. I would assume that most people listening to this show know they're not the ideal form of electricity generation. There are a number of problems with them. One is that the mining for coal is not particularly safe for the people engaged in doing it. It's not particularly good for the environment, just the mining component. And then, of course, the operation of coal-fired power plants is both not particularly safe for people because of what's discharged into the air and the number of people that kills every year, and is not great for the environment holistically. So, yes, it's what we've used for a long time, but that was also because it was what was readily available for a long time. But coal plants are going offline at an increasing rate across the U.S. And then the question becomes, the coal plant works, right, Lance? I mean, pretty much whether the sun is up or the wind is blowing, the coal plant can burn away and produce that electricity. So while the negative effects of something like wind or solar are substantially less, the one big con is that if the sun not shining or the wind not blowing, Lance still needs his lamp on so that he can read his book and so that he can see his baseball game and so that he can cook his dinner, right? I mean, like there are still things that need to happen when the sun goes down in modern society.
That's true.
Or for Justin to charge his electric car overnight.
That's right.
These are all realistic things that have to be considered. So batteries are going to be a big deal because you can't just switch over to wind and solar and everything be hunky-dory without an option to make sure that you have power when those intermittent forms of power are not producing.
Well, because with wind and solar, there are times when you are generating more power than the grid needs, but you have to have a way to store that so that you can hold on to it. So when you are in the evening and it is nighttime or the wind isn't blowing, you can now tap into the reserve power through the batteries. And then also you have to create the lines or the transmission to get the power from the batteries to the grid and then from the grid to the consumer.
And of course, the expense, right, of batteries. I mean, that's a cost component of what affects your energy usage. So one of the ongoing questions has been, in the interim, obviously, battery technology continues to improve, which we've talked about on the State of Us, because different types of batteries are better suited for different types of situations. And we don't have to bore people with, chemistry of batteries and why that matters. But suffices to say, there are different forms of batteries, and some batteries may be better suited for the power grid, where a different type of battery might be good for Lance's flip phone, right? They're not necessarily a one-for-one, interchangeable sort of thing. So battery technology is increasing, which is tremendous, but we have to do something in the interim because based on what the article tells us, Lance, I get the feeling that we're not going to be quite where we need to be on that front by the time that we are taking offline some of these aging power plants. So something has to be done in the interim. One of the things is that the natural gas industry obviously has pushed into the fray and said, we are here. Of the various non-renewable forms of energy, right? They would tell you, and I think generally the science supports, they are a much cleaner form of energy, far cleaner. I mean, if you had to choose between coal power plant or natural gas, and those are the only options, you choose natural gas.
Exactly.
Far better for the environment, for the people in the immediate vicinity, air pollution, that kind of stuff. Because you have to have, and that's what the article talks about some, Lance, right, is a base form of backup energy generation in the interim of this transition to whatever the batteries might look like for renewable energy.
That's true. Or the other side of this is we just cut back on our energy use. Oh, don't inconvenience me, right?
Right.
Oh,
so,
sorry. The dead silence across the airwaves there. You expect me to do what? What? You expect me to use less? You're just going on and on about all these things I need it for. I'm going to, but just to throw that in there, throw the curveball in there. You could try to live with less electricity while we're trying to get this done. And since
some people are not going to have a choice.
Since the silence in the room was deafening, you probably don't want to do that. So where do we go? If you don't want to use less, you have to create more.
Well, and I think that it's worth noting that some people are not going to have a choice, right? I mean, that's part of what the article points out, and you mentioned earlier, is the rolling blackout thing. They're just going to turn it off, Oh, can't give you any power right now. Too bad, And I mean, you can complain and moan and whatever, but at the end of the day, you're not going to make them, they can't give you what's not there. So everybody gets upset at the power company, like, turn off the power on me, but it's also, I don't know how much you can blame them because it's kind of like, well, what do you want us to do? We can't make power out of thin air. If the power is not here, I can't give you the power. It's kind of that, it's sort of that basic.
But increasing the price, and again, I'm talking about, can you pay for this? And I told, earlier in the show, I said, I've noticed in the last 6 months, my bill has increased. That's made me start to conserve. I go around and make sure things are unplugged if they're no need to be plugged in, or lights are turned off, or what. So again, I think part of this is that we want cheap energy. Some people would say, well, we just want it affordable. But I think affordable is a misnomer. I think what we want is cheap energy.
Efficient energy.
Well, we want it efficient, but that means cheap as well. And we don't want to pay a lot for it. And I think we're coming into a time when we have so much technology that has made our lives easier using electricity. We've kind of forgotten that component that, oh, well, the reason I can do all of this is because, well, now I'm going to have to pay for that. And I think it's a wake up call to us as a nation, as people, that if we want all of these time saving devices and these things that make our lives easier, it comes at a cost. And for the last 50 or 60 years, we really haven't had to eat any of the cost of making our lives faster. And I'm sorry, as an old person, I won't say better. Okay. I won't say better, because none of this is new. We've just found faster ways to do what we used to do. I mean, I could have gone to the library and looked up stuff for the show, right? But it's easier on the internet. It's faster. It's not new, but it is a faster way. It has given us time to fill our days with more mindless activity.
Right. Well, and I think the nature of being in a society driven by business and money, which isn't I'm not digging at that specifically. I'm just saying that's part of capitalism, folks. If you're out there and you're listening and you're a proponent of it, to grow,
but
to evolve.
But Andrew Carnegie made money without electricity.
Well, yeah, but
so I mean, we can have money and capitalism without electricity.
The engine of progress is to push technology of all forms. I don't mean just computers. I mean, back in the day, right? Technology could have been an oil burning lamp. That was technology at one point. Okay.
That is true.
And people looked on that, well, we don't need this. We had candles, it's a freaking oil burning lamp. We don't need that. We don't need to spend money on it.
I burn candles.
Right. And before candles, we don't need candles. When the sun goes down, you're done for the day.
You go to bed.
Right.
Like you're supposed to. And you wake up when the sun comes up.
If you live, right, and part of the reason that we have electricity and the light bulb and all of this is partly because business said, hey, we could make more money if people could work around the clock. If we didn't have to shut down at night, we could make more money.
But now we have the problem that nobody wants to work. So it doesn't matter. I'm coming home on Friday night and everything is at 9 o'clock, after 9 o'clock is closed. I can't pick up a sandwich after the ball game because nobody wants to work. So they can't keep the place open anymore. So hey, we're saving energy. Sorry.
That's right.
You're going on your diatribe and I'm interrupting, but I'm just throwing in another option here.
Yes.
Nobody wants to work. So
and there's not enough workers.
Everybody, not enough workers. True. Not enough workers, but people aren't working. And so everything just shuts down. So, hey, we're saving energy, right?
When
McDonald's closes, when McDonald's and Pizza Hut close at 9 o'clock, we're saving energy.
Yes, we are.
We're reverting to the old days, right?
That's
Where sun goes down, we quit working.
Yep.
We're saving energy. All right.
We are saving energy. So, but that is a reality of, obviously, there are other options. I mean, to Lance's point, it's not like society has to go under simply because, we change our power usage. At the same time, it's also worth noting that, as these severe weather events have proven and these power outages prove, people will die. I mean, that will happen. Whether you're in hospitals, nursing homes, whether, food spoils and we can't get enough to you because we can't keep it good. The backbone of modern society is built on the access to power systems that keep society humming the way that it's built. Now, we can change that, but that doesn't come without, pain and a rethinking of what we care about in the world. And arguably people would be faster to spend the inordinate amount of money, borrow the money as part of the federal government's debt, and, fix the quote unquote, fix the problem so that progress, quote unquote, can continue. And I think that is part of the ultimate question of, we have to do, we don't have to. We don't have to do anything. If we're okay with people dying, if we're okay with changing our usage habits, we do not have to do anything about the grid problem. from a realistic standpoint, I think most people probably feel like we have to do something about it because we're not willing to accept the alternative options. So from that standpoint, if we must do something, the sooner we start, I think the better, because as this points out, we're already on a trajectory for serious issues, regardless of what you do with renewable energy. Or if you're just talking renewable energy, you still have to do something about the grid. It's not a 1-for-1. And the grid capacity, which we've covered on other shows, Lance, it has to expand. We've talked about that too. Again, unless you're willing to say society is not going to continue to grow, we don't want there to be more people, we don't want more business. If we don't want those things, then we don't have to grow the grid. But if we do want those things, which we sort of most of society accepts as yes, we want growth, then we have to expand the grid. Not the least of which is that things continue to move toward using electric over older forms of energy. Just moving to electric vehicles alone is going to require serious, investment in the grid. So it's a multi-pronged problem, and there's not enough time to talk about all of it today, but we've tried to talk about a little bit of it, right, Lance?
Yeah, we have. And, tune in next time when Justin and I go head to head over nuclear energy. So that show's coming up.
That may need to be its own.
Yeah, it'll be its own show, because we will knock heads about that. But don't think, when you email us at podcast@thestateofus.org and tell us, well, you guys didn't talk about nuclear. Well, we didn't, because we could have an entire
you can't talk about it for 2 minutes
conversation about that. So we'll have to do that another time. But Justin's painted such a tristful picture. But I'm excited about this, and that is that True Chat has a mission. And our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. But, hopefully you've listened, you've enjoyed, you're not totally just bummed out. It's like, okay, now I'm aware of this. We're going to try to do something about it. We're going to call our local politician, and we're going to try to get this taken care of sooner rather than later. And share it with your friends. Tell them they can listen to us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found. And I'm still tristful, even though I crushed Justin in the word of the day.
The one bright spot to give people is that really most of these issues are not, none of them are insurmountable. I mean, they are things that for the most part, the technology exists today. It may not be as good as we want it to be, but we could fix it all if we wanted to. So it's not like, oh my God, we're going to have to invent things that have never before, seen the light of day, and we have no idea how to take on this problem. It's really not one of those things. There are ways to address this. Some are better than others. Some cost less than others. It's really just a decision about, it's not a sexy thing, and we must do something. And lawmakers need to not be sitting on their hands and get to work on doing something.
Amen.
Because it will be considerably less sexy than it is right now as the problems get worse. We will all be more upset if we don't do something today. And that's part of why we had the conversation, hopefully. So The State of Us can be heard Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast, first thing in the mornings, and can be heard on the weekends in select AM and FM radio stations across the country. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for using that electricity to listen to us. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.